The longer you have known me, the less you may connect me with the word silence. As I grew up, I was a relatively quiet child. Now, you would have to confirm with mom and dad on that, but I talked at home, but I didn't talk much anywhere else. Sunday school, I knew the answers, so I always spoke out then. But I was a fairly quiet, shy child until the ninth grade when I tried out for a play, and then it was all downhill from there. I've been kind of boisterous, kind of loud, kind of extroverted. And the louder I've been, the more I've sought to, at many points in my life, to drown out the silence. Because in the silence, what we have is a moment of being face to face with God and face to face with ourselves. And for most of us, that might be an uncomfortable place to be, because we know what our limitations are. We know where our touchy spots are, the raw within us. And so in the silence, that raw rises up. That shame or that anger or that guilt or that sadness or depression or that happiness or whatever may be hidden in there rises up to greet us. And sometimes we're afraid of the visitors that come to us in that silence. And so we drown it out. Now, it might not be our own noise that we drown it out with. Oftentimes, we drown it out with other kinds of things. We have more television channels than I can even imagine. There are more programs you cannot watch than there are that you can. And I say that because who needs 1,200 possibilities at any given moment? Apparently we do. And it's not enough to have one program, but now the newest model, of course, is on Netflix and on Prime and even on Apple TV. You can binge watch. YouTube too. Don't want to leave anybody out. YouTube TV, you can binge watch a show from beginning to end, never have to wait till next week to hear about it. You can just go and you can anesthetize yourself to any sense of silence. And if it's not the television, you can turn on music of some kind. Or you can talk to yourself. Or anything to silence the silence in our lives. Well, the truth is, I am convinced that the core of Jesus' life and the core that's meant to be our lives is a place of silence. And the place of silence is not a place you go to physically. You don't have to wait until you're in a worship space, wherever that worship space is. I tend to have most of my silence. I tend to have most of my silence in one space in our house. And it is essentially my office at home. And I go in there, I have a comfortable chair that I sit in, and every morning that's where I do 25 minutes of my morning sit. In silence. That's where I go for silence. But there's a silence that we carry within, and I've come to realize, I sat down this week to figure out how long I have been practicing silence, meditative silence, and it's just shy of 12 years. Just shy of 12 years, I have been sitting in silence, usually twice a day, but at least once a day. I sit in the quiet, and the quiet isn't always quiet. Sometimes, let me just tell you, in the spring and summertime, those birds outside my window are singing like there's no tomorrow. So there's no such, it's not that it's quiet, but the silence is not outside myself in the vibratory noises that come my way. The silence is within, in the central part of who I am, in the heart. And that silence informs the way I really enter into the rest of my life. Someone recently told me that they experienced me as a person of peace. I took that as a very high compliment. Another person told me that I was like the Calm app on their cell phone. That they just came near me and stood there for a while, and somehow they felt calm again. Now, if you've known me long enough, that may not be what you remember most about me, because I'm not sure when I first came to St. James in 1992 that calmness would have been the thing that people said about me. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was Mr. running around like a chicken with my head cut off. That's what it was like when I came to St. James 32 years ago, when they projected me for this appointment, which wasn't even in this building, but in another location. And they told me, James, we're appointing you close because your wife's still in seminary. Linda was still in seminary at that point. And St. James is probably going to close because it's in decline. But we're not going to hold it against you because we know what's going on there. And it didn't go that way. Obviously, 32 years later, here we are. But there was not much silence in those days. I didn't speak from a place of silence. I didn't live from a place of silence. I lived from a place of noise, my own noise mostly. So I'm speaking from experience when I say silence is an important part of life, but it's not just an important part of mine. Jesus modeled silence. There was a lot more silence in Jesus than there was chatting. He would go off by himself every day to be present with God. Oftentimes, he would pause before he said anything in response to someone. Most of what we see Jesus doing is walking from place to place. He was on a journey. He was on a path. He was going from here to there. Now, along the way, he would stop and talk to somebody, but the path of Jesus' life was a kind of inner silence that informed who he was, the way he behaved. Probably my favorite story, one of my favorite Jesus stories is John chapter 8. It became my favorite story after I wrote a 35-page paper about it when I was in seminary. But in John chapter 8, it's the woman caught in adultery, and Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," and everybody disperses and leaves. But in the middle of that, we're told Jesus wrote on the ground. For 2,000 years, people have been trying to imagine what Jesus wrote. I wonder if he wasn't just taking time to pause as he figured out what the best possible response was to what he had been challenged with. Jesus was careful. Well, Jesus wasn't the first one. There are lots of wonderful biblical stories that come before him that model silence. And the one I want to share with you this morning, particularly, and then I'm going to share a teaching of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. But to begin with, I want to share a little bit of a story from the book of 1 Kings, the first book of the Kings. And it's about Elijah, who was a prophet. And his name essentially means Yahweh is my God. That's what his name means, Yahweh is my God. He was a great prophet, remembered well in Israel. And but what's interesting about him is, for all his successes, and the place we find him in this reading is right after a success. He had a fairly major success. He had been in a kind of dualistic battle between the Baal, the believers in a different God, and Yahweh. And he had won. Hands down, he had won. And it was kind of then bloody after the Old Testament stories are, you win, just demonstrate your God is the best, and then you chop everybody else up, which is not a very attractive part of the story. But immediately after that, Elijah has this major letdown, and he runs away. He runs away into the wilderness, and we find him in the wilderness. He's been in the wilderness for a long time, and I want to read to you part of that story because he wants to face God. So he goes to the mountain. An angel has told him in a dream, go to the mountain, go to Mount Horeb. And so that's where he has wound up. And so that same messenger from God says to him after he gets to Mount Horeb, because we meet God a lot in the Bible on mountains, he said, that messenger said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard the silence, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" What are you doing here, Elijah, indeed? Now, what I find most intriguing about this particular story, as I think about it and listen to it, is the places you first expect to meet God is in power. If you know anything about the story, the biblical story from the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of demonstrative big acts where God shows up. In fact, earlier in this story, I told you the competition between the prophets. Elijah calls fire from heaven, and it comes. Very demonstrative. And so he's in the wilderness now, and you think, big wind, such a powerful wind. Imagine a hurricane or a tornado. It is destructive. It is blowing rocks out of the way, and that's not an easy thing to do. That's happening. But God wasn't in this huge demonstrative hurricane. Next, there's an earthquake and shaking of the ground. You know, we talk about that the earth quaked and shook at the death of Jesus on the cross. It was demonstrative. We have this sense that something big happened. And yet, in this earthquake, the Lord wasn't in that earthquake either. Then there was a fire. Now, I don't know how to picture the fire, but it must have been big. But God wasn't in the fire either. And then there's the sound of sheer silence. It's been translated also, you might have heard of the still small voice, but translates a little bit better from Hebrew as sheer silence, absolute silence. And God was in that silence. And Elijah knew it was God. And as we all know, you can't look, from the Hebrew Bible, can't look on the face of God and live. So he wraps his mantle around his face and he stands outside the cave, or right in the entrance to the cave, so that he can hear whatever it is that God might have to say. And in the sheer silence, God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, it's not as if God doesn't know why Elijah has come. Elijah is about, and we're not reading this part, Elijah is about to complain about the fact that he's the only faithful one left. He's the only one that's doing God's will. He's the only one that takes God seriously. Everybody else, is failed. Absolutely failed all the way to the core of their being. And so he just wants to eat dirt and die. I mean, that's not an exact quote by any stretch of the imagination, but he's done. I've been faithful. Nobody else has been faithful. I'm done. I'm done. Why have you come here, Elijah? Well, I've come here for a conversation. I've come here for an open space to listen to what you have to say about what I've been up to. And you want to hear from me? Well, here's my deal. And then God has a response. The bottom line is we live in a world that's noisy, noisy, noisy. It's not just the noises we choose, like whether we watch TV or listen to the radio or any of those other kinds of things like that. There are lots of noises around us all the time. I have on my watch, there's an whatever that sound, a decibelometer or whatever they're called, that measures the volume. And there is virtually no time ever when my little thing is not dancing. It's usually green. Let me go walking next to traffic. It goes yellow and warns me I could lose my hearing if I stand and sit next to traffic for 8.5 hours. I could have a negative impact of my traffic. Now, I've been to a couple of concerts where it went to the red and it says, a couple of hours of this, ruin your hearing for life, or at least temporarily. So it's always warning me about sounds. There is never a time here in Northern Virginia where I live. I don't know about where all of you are. There's never a time when there's not some kind of noise. It seems very noisy. And I think noise keeps us from focus. And it's not just the sound noise, it is the life noises of all the things we think we must schedule in order to get them done. All the ways that we're sure we're in control of our lives. If I have learned one thing in my meditative life of the last almost 12 years, it is I am not in control at all. I sit in silence and I let go of my thoughts. I'd like to tell you I let them go once and then it's blank until the bell rings. That would be an absolute lie, and I don't believe in absolute lies. I let go. As soon as I let go of one thought, another comes, and another comes, and another comes. You might say to yourself, well, what's the point of even trying? I keep letting go of the thoughts. It's a wonderful practice for the rest of my life. Let me ask you a question about silence versus non-silence. You don't have to answer it aloud if you're in the room or wherever you are watching, whenever you're watching. But how many times have you just let whatever thought arose come out of your mouth in response to what somebody said to you or to what you saw in the world? Second question, and how many times when you let that first thought out your mouth did you regret? How many times did you say something you couldn't unsay? Something mean, something ugly, some secret you didn't want to be known, but it popped in your head and you said it out loud and now it's out there. How many times when you don't live out of silence have you said or done things that didn't come from the silence but came from your own little petty desires? A lot of time in my life. It's a moment of confession. I'll just tell you right up here. Prior to beginning a meditative practice in my life, prior to that, I didn't know what was going to come out of my mouth next. I didn't like silence, so when silence arose, I filled it with words. Even if the words were innocuous and pointless and empty, I filled those moments. Because silence made me uncomfortable. Because in silence, as I said in the beginning, in silence, I could feel the rawness and the shame and the guilt and the sadness and all the pieces of life that don't always feel good, could feel them. So if I just filled the silence, I never had a chance to connect with that. I didn't have to face it. I'm convinced you don't need somebody else to tell you, maybe unless you're a narcissist. You don't need somebody else to tell you what's going wrong in your life or the ways that you've made mistakes. Most everyone I know is actually amazing at keeping track of every little tiny mistake they've ever made in their lives and bringing them up to make them feel bad about themselves. It just keeps, your inner critic just goes on and on and on and on about all the mistakes you've made. It's hard to reflect the goodness of God, to be a mirror for God's work inside of us when we're not open, to shutting down that voice and letting it go. Now, I'm not telling you that since I began a meditative, quiet practice every day with God, that I still haven't said some really stupid things. Linda could bear witness. My children could bear witness. People who know me could bear witness. But it doesn't happen as much. The first thing that comes to my mind does not jump out of my mouth. You know, science can't even tell us where our thoughts come from. If you think, like I used to think, they all come from right here, where your brain is, they can't locate anything inside of you that indicates where the thought arises from. It's like almost there's a common consciousness out of which thoughts arise. You have thoughts about things that make you really like want to turn the other way. And you have great thoughts. And you have in between mediocre thoughts. And you'll be sitting there and you can't even tell why that thought just popped in your head. Are you having some of those right now? Strange thoughts. Oh, I forgot that at home. Oh, James said, come back to the moment. I'm coming back to the moment. Oh, what about, lunch. Oh, I'm going to have, letting that go. Wonder what Josh is going to cook for me at home today. I'm suddenly thinking about that. Last week, he surprised us with a breakfast casserole that was unbelievably delicious. He might make us scones today. I suspect that we have scone mix now. He might make us scones. I don't know. But you see how easy it was? I just gave you a little flow of what happens in my brain. But these days, somebody says something mean to me, there's a better chance I'm not going to respond than I will. That doesn't mean I won't. And sometimes I say it because I can. But most of the time, as I see that thought rising, I let it slip away in silence, and I live from that silent place because I carry it with me all the time. And the way I respond doesn't make me any better than anyone else. But it's not from the place of anger. It's not the first thing that jumps in my mind. It's not the desire to win an argument, because I have really, really learned no one ever does. No one ever wins an argument. Even when it's all based on facts, no one ever wins. Because there are always more facts. And there are always more opinions about the facts. So it's challenging. So I want to say to you right now, we are invited to live from a place of silence. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about what prayer looks like, in chapter 6 of Matthew, verse 6, he says, whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. It's one verse. I'm going to read it to you again. Whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, what's interesting is the earliest church fathers and mothers interpreted that particular text not about going into a physical room. You know, one of the translations says, go into your closet and pray. Do it in private. Do it in private. But the earliest church leaders, the first several centuries, saw that room as not a physical room, but a place within yourself. Go into your heart. Enter into the silence of your heart, because that's where God dwells, in the silence of your heart, in a place deeper than you even have access to yourself, within yourself. God dwells there. And if you go stand adjacent, you feel the presence of God. And you experience God's reality in your life. That's why we pray. And that's why we do it in the silence and in the quiet spaces. Oftentimes we miss those opportunities. So one of the things I want to do for you right now is I want to invite you into a practice. I'm going to do a quick directed, guided meditation moment for you. Now, it's not, guided meditation is a different feel. Let me just give it to you. It's a different feel than just sitting in absolute silence. I use guided meditations personally, on and off, sometimes. But mostly, I just practice sitting in silence. That's most of my practice. But sometimes it's helpful when another voice invites you to a deeper place and invites you to know God in the deepest way. And so it is, I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to invite John to give us a little message in the background. And obviously, with music in the background, as I've invited you, it's just meant to calm yourself. This is not silence, obviously, when we have music playing in the background. But the peaceful music is meant to just be a dropping back place to remind us. Now, I want to invite all of you, in person and online, to close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you've entered a cave. Maybe it's cool in the cave. You feel the cool moisture of the air on your skin. Perhaps there's a breeze coming up from deep within the earth to fill the cave and then blowing out the opening, the cave opening. Perhaps it's very dark. So dark you cannot see. You can see behind you. We're walking a little, right now we're a little deeper in the cave. You can see the opening where the sunlight is making its way in. But otherwise, everywhere else you look, it is pitch black. You cannot see your own hand in front of your face. Now imagine the cave that you're in is the cave of your heart. You've come to this cave to meet God. You've run away from everything else, all the ways that you feel like you're a failure or like you're a success. You've moved away from those because you want to connect with God. Maybe like Elijah, you've got some serious questions about the way God runs things. Or maybe you've got a plea for something you need in your life. But you've come to this cave, this place in your heart. And in the midst of this quiet space, things begin to change. The world shakes a little bit around you, but you're still in the cave. You hear the wind blowing rapidly outside, but you're still safe in this cave. Perhaps you see fire in the distance, but you're still in this cave, and you let each of those things pass by. Because as much as you're drawn to big dramatic effects, that's where you don't expect you'll probably meet God. And suddenly, you feel the silence. Only this silence is a different silence. The air seems to kind of crackle with an aliveness. And spirit comes to you. And says, "Why have you come here? What do you want? What do you want?" Now, in in the next couple of seconds of silence, I want you to imagine what your response would be. You're finally face to face, if you will. You've peered out of the cave. You're face to face with the divine. As you peer out to connect with the divine in the crackling silence, what is it you need to say? Is it a question? Is it a disappointment? Is it a struggle? What do you give into this moment? I'm going to give you just a moment in your heart to speak that truth. Now, do you hear an answer rising up? Or will you have to wait? Do you feel that answer? You can come back from the silence. You see, every time we enter into silence, we listen. We listen. When it's silent, we listen. And suddenly the sweet screams of little squeals of happiness of a little girl penetrate, but not in a way that makes us frustrated. Actually, it just kind of gives us joy to think there are people who are so excited about life that they can just squeal about it. Sometimes we wish we could squeal about it. But when you become adults, it's a little less acceptable for us to squeal when we see something we love. Ah, it's a bird! Woo! You know, maybe if you're by yourself and no one else can see you. But if you did that, like you go to the zoo and you look, oh, it's a rhinoceros! Everyone's like, get away from that guy. Each one of us experiences that truth, that reality. So listen in silence. I want to challenge you this week. You don't have to shoot for 25 minutes. All of my training in centering prayer is 20 minutes. And 25 minutes is what I do now when I sit in silence and meditate. But you don't have to start there. You can start where you are. Wherever that is, find a couple of minutes in your day when you're just quiet, when you let go of your thoughts and you listen for what you hear. You may hear God right away. You may not ever hear God. But you'll never know if you don't listen. You will never know if you don't. So I encourage you to try. This week, that's your challenge. Set aside a couple of minutes. I would target 5, but set aside as many minutes as you can afford. If you're up for 20, go for it. Go for it. But set a couple of moments aside and listen. Don't talk. Turn off the radio, turn off the TV, turn off all the sounds that you've chosen, and just see what you hear. Because God is present everywhere at all times. And silence is one of the ways God speaks. One of the ways God speaks. Linda has a moment of reflection for us.
In thinking of what James shared, I was reminded when I was a youth and was kind of first on my faith journey. I lived on a farm northwest of Baltimore and in Upper Combe, Maryland. And one of the things that I did regularly was to walk back into the woods at the farm and just listen to the silence. And in that time, I felt closer to God than pretty much any other time. And over time, being outside in nature has always been a connecting point in my faith, in my time with God, because in those moments, you can hear so many things in creation, and thoughts that arise in me at the same time. And many times I feel that's an opportunity when God has spoken to me. And then I became an adult, and I filled my life with foolish noise. The busyness of life, always needing to have things moving. And it was very hard for me to connect and to listen to God. And I thought that prayer was all about me producing a litany of what I was concerned about, when in fact, although that's helpful to share those things with God, God already knows what I'm concerned about. I don't even need to speak them out loud because God knows my heart. So I have moved over the last year and a half back to intentional silence. And it's made a huge difference for me. I'm less reactive. I feel like I'm a better listener when people need things or are talking to me. And I feel like I am able to listen to God a little bit more. So that silence has been really important to me, is coming back to that and realizing how much I can learn and grow in the midst of that quiet. So my hope is that you will try it if that's not something that's a part of your life, and know that God will meet you there in the silence.